Russian President Vladimir Putin has just rejected peace in Ukraine, putting the US on a collision course with Russia in the process. US President Donald Trump believed his strong negotiation tactics were pushing Russia and Ukraine closer to a ceasefire from which peace could form. But now, Putin is saying he'll continue his supposed special military operation. That leaves Trump with a choice. Does he continue pushing for peace, or does he get more involved in Ukraine's effort to repel Putin's forces? On April 1st, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, poured water on the US peace fire by claiming that Russia cannot accept any peace deal proposed by the US in its current form. While the Putin mouthpiece said that Russia was taking America's ideas very seriously, which seems like more Putin lip service for peace, the Kremlin also isn't satisfied with the current terms of the proposed Black Sea and energy infrastructure ceasefires. Speaking to Russia's International Affairs magazine, Ryabkov said, "We have not heard a signal from Trump to Kyiv to end the war. All that we have today is an attempt to find a certain scheme that would allow us to achieve a ceasefire, as it's conceived by the Americans." It's that supposed scheme that seems to lie at the heart of Putin's problems with the current peace proposals. Russia isn't necessarily concerned with the conditions of the ceasefires, which would only last for 30 days, giving it valuable time to recoup before it renewed its assaults on Ukraine. Far more concerning to Russia is what happens after the ceasefire, and then move on to some other models and schemes, Ryabkov said, in which, as far as we can judge, today there is no place for our main demand, namely the solution of problems related to the root causes of this conflict. The Putin mouthpiece then went on to claim that any solutions revolving around these root causes are completely absent, meaning Russia simply can't accept any peace proposals as they currently stand. So what exactly does Putin believe is the root cause of the Ukraine conflict? To almost any observer outside of Russia's upper echelons, the root cause of the Ukraine war seems obvious. Putin wants more land, more power, and greater influence over European geopolitics. He launched his Ukraine invasion to gain all three. Therefore, Putin is the root cause of the conflict, and the solution for that cause will be found if Putin withdraws his soldiers from Ukraine, allowing the embattled nation to once again assert its sovereignty. But while the rest of the world sees Ukraine as a sovereign nation, Putin views that very sovereignty as the root cause of his invasion. The Times outlines this in its report on Putin's refusal to accept peace terms. It says that the root causes terminology is essentially Kremlin shorthand for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's pro-Western government in Ukraine. To Putin, he shouldn't exist at all, meaning nothing short of removing Zelensky from power would satisfy Putin's demands. That isn't going to happen, as the US knows that removing Zelensky now would damage Ukraine's democracy while opening the door for Putin to install a Kremlin puppet into the Ukrainian seat of power. Putin's condition for accepting peace is the very reason that he invaded in the first place. He wants to control Ukraine. Russia's leader might claim otherwise. Putin has at numerous points suggested that NATO's expansion is his reason, or at least part of the reason for invading Ukraine. By controlling Ukraine, Putin would have a country that borders several NATO nations, giving him a chance to stop what he sees as NATO expansionism in his tracks. He'll assume that everybody will just ignore how his actions in Ukraine showcase Russian expansionism and his own hypocrisy. But the real reason Putin wants Ukraine is that he doesn't believe the nation should exist. Don't forget that Putin is a relic of the Cold War era. He operated within Russia's KGB from 1975 up until he began his political career, meaning he's essentially lived in two eras of Russia. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union still existed, and Russia had an empire that influenced global geopolitics and controlled plenty of territory inside Europe. Ukraine was among that territory. But the Cold War ended in 1991, and with it came the collapse of the Soviet Union. And with the Soviet Union gone, Putin watched as nations that were previously under Russia's control became independent and created democracies. Ukraine was one of those nations, and to Putin, all of this amounted to the West making moves to control territory that was once under Russian control. He sees those moves as immoral. The West opened the door for Ukraine to exist in the first place, when it was, and always should have been, part of Russia in Putin's eyes. The last 2 decades have revealed Putin's relentless obsession with retaking Ukraine for Russia. In 2004, he attempted to interfere in Ukraine's presidential elections with the goal of installing a pro-Russian candidate. Success there would have given Putin immediate influence over Ukraine, in addition to creating a backdoor that could lead to him absorbing the country into Russia. Those 2004 efforts ultimately failed, but they didn't stop Putin. In 2014, he orchestrated uprisings in several pro-Russian areas of Ukraine, including regions in Luhansk and Donetsk, in addition to annexing Crimea. And of course, February 2022 brought with it Putin's supposed special military operation and his attempt to take full control of Ukraine that rages to this day. Solving the root cause of the Ukraine crisis means erasing Ukraine from the map altogether. He's already referring to the occupied territories in Ukraine as Russia forever, and has in the past made several claims that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Solving Russia's root cause would mean no more Ukraine. Putin is also creating impossible conditions for peace to happen, giving him the ability to refuse the US proposals and continue his war. Even now, he's floating ideas that he knows nobody will accept. For instance, March 28 saw him suggest that Ukraine should be placed under the temporary control of the United Nations or UN until the country is able to hold elections that will lead to a more competent government being put in place. Translation: the UN should wrest power from Zelensky and create an environment in which Putin can install his own candidate for Ukraine's presidency. Ukraine accused Putin of suggesting crazy ideas designed to delay any further movement toward peace. Ukraine was right. All of this adds up to Putin making impossible demands for a peace he never intends to create. And it's those demands that are placing Russia on a collision course with the United States. On March 31, one day before Putin rejected the current peace proposals, Trump was already claiming to be very angry with Putin. He was reacting to Putin's comments about removing Zelensky from power, particularly the Russian leader's claims that Zelensky wasn't fit for the job of leading Ukraine. If I feel we're in the midst of a negotiation, you could say that I was very angry, pissed off when Putin said yesterday that, when Putin started getting into Zelensky's credibility, because that's not going in the right direction, Trump claimed. Putin must have thought he'd be safe in criticizing the Ukrainian president's leadership skills. After all, it wasn't so long ago that Putin seemed to have Trump on his side in that regard. In the wake of the meeting between US and Russian representatives in Saudi Arabia, Trump labeled Zelensky a dictator and questioned why Ukraine's leader was refusing to hold elections while his country was at war with Russia. Only a few days later, Trump suspended military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Those suspensions have since been lifted, and Trump now appears to be far more entrenched in Zelensky's camp than Putin's. Russia's leader might have miscalculated how angry Trump would get by his claims that Zelensky should be outed, and that miscalculation may cost Russia. It could have also set the stage for Putin's later refusal to sign any peace agreement. He now sees that he's not going to get what he wants out of the US, which is the end of Ukraine as a sovereign nation. And now, Trump is gearing up to respond to Putin's peace refusal by offering even more support to Ukraine. If Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia, said Trump in an interview with NBC News. That would be that if you buy oil from Russia, you can't do business in the United States. There will be a 25% tariff on all oil, a 25 to 50-point tariff on all oil. Though it feels a little like Trump was making up this threat on the spot, Putin has to take it seriously. The US president has already implemented tariffs against the likes of China, Canada, and Mexico. And while these secondary tariffs, which are a new mechanism created by Trump, wouldn't hit Russia's oil sales directly, they'd still cause major financial problems for Putin. That's the first way that Trump may deepen US support of Ukraine. The idea behind a secondary tariff is that it punishes the countries that do business with the nation onto which the US wants to place pressure. Trump is suggesting them because a direct US tariff on Russian oil wouldn't do much. The US has already banned all imports of Russian oil and related products, meaning the US would have to start buying Russian oil again before a direct tariff would have any impact. Far more damaging are the losses in Russian oil revenue the secondary tariffs could cause. In 2024, Russia made $192 billion from its crude oil and other oil products. That's nearly $200 billion being pumped into a country that's spending almost $1 billion per day on Putin's Ukraine invasion, according to Ukraine's military intelligence chief Kirilo Budanov. This is an extremely expensive war. A day of war costs slightly less than $1 billion, and for them this is a huge amount of money, Budanov claimed in February 2025. He also noted that Russia's 2025 budget suggests that it will spend 8% of its gross domestic product on defense, along with 41% of its federal budget. 41% is the defense budget. These are abnormal figures. To implement this budget, almost all social, medical and educational programs were curtailed, Budanov added. In other words, Putin is already hurting Russia to fund the Ukraine war. Trump's suggestion of secondary tariffs would hurt it even more. If Trump follows through, Russia's major oil clients, which include China, India, and remarkably the European Union, or EU, would have something to think about. Right now, China buys 47% of Russia's crude oil. India accounts for 37%, with the EU and Turkey buying 6% each. All told, that's 30 nations that the US would force into paying secondary tariffs for buying Russia's oil. It's hard to say how many of them will keep buying, with the threat of those tariffs looming over their heads. Trump's use of these tariffs would place Russia in a difficult position, where it has to work even harder to convince its current oil clients to stick with it. If any of them, especially China or India, look elsewhere, Russia will take a multi-billion-dollar hit to its oil business that it can ill afford at a time when it's spending so much money to fund Putin's Ukraine invasion. Then there's the possibility that Trump could go deeper down the military aid route. The US is already one of the top contributors of military aid to Ukraine, though the exact figure it's delivered is under question. Congress has passed 5 bills confirming aid deliveries, the most recent of which was voted on in April 2024. That delivered a total budget authority of $175 billion. That's the headline figure, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, and Ukraine has used that money for everything from supplying its military to supporting its people. Late 2024 also saw the US deliver a $20 billion loan using the interest generated from the $67 billion in Russian assets invested into the US dollar. Those assets are currently frozen, with the loan essentially being a donation. Ukraine is under no obligation to repay it, at least not to the United States. However, an enormous portion of the committed aid has actually been spent in the United States. It's paying for US weapons manufacturers and their workers to produce the equipment being sent to Ukraine. So, you could view the US military aid commitment to Ukraine as a way for America to pump up a sector of its economy, along with the means for the country to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Though that aid has been called into question in recent months. In February 2025, Trump claimed that the US had actually sent $350 billion to Ukraine, which is around double the figure reported by the Council on Foreign Relations. We also can't forget the issues surrounding the suspension of that aid in early March. Though that suspension has been lifted and US weapons are once again flowing into Ukraine, the US has created a situation in which Ukraine can never quite feel certain that it has America's full support. But that may be about to change now that Putin has rejected the US peace deal. Trump may follow up his secondary tariffs by committing more US weapons to Ukraine. He'd likely do that as a punishment for Putin, as Russia has refused the peace that Trump wants to create as part of his legacy during his second stint as US president, meaning Trump will give Putin the war he wants by delivering even more aid to Ukraine. However, Trump may also increase the US aid budget because doing so delivers several advantages to the US president. For one, it will allow him to strengthen Ukraine's defenses, thus counteracting what the Atlantic Council calls former President Joe Biden's flawed approach to providing military assistance in the past. The Council says that Biden's cautious approach meant that Ukraine has only ever received enough aid from the US to survive the war, but not to win it. Given that Putin is refusing peace, Trump may switch course and start sending more aid than ever to Ukraine. As the Atlantic Council puts it, Trump could now correct Biden's mistake by making a historic presidential drawdown and surging military assistance to Ukraine in order to bring Russia to the table. It also argues that Trump might even be able to use the Repo Act, which enables the US to confiscate Russian assets to unfreeze the money Russia has invested into the US dollar and send it to Ukraine. Granted, this would be a reversal of Trump's previous messaging that Ukraine should fight on its own, and Europe isn't doing enough to support the country. However, if being the president who delivers peace in the Ukraine conflict via negotiation is off the table, Trump may instead settle for being the one who creates peace through force. He'd still score the same political points domestically. He'll be able to position himself as the president who ended the Ukraine war one way or another. Plus, committing more aid now would allow the US to demonstrate to Putin that it's able to hit him hard when Russia is at its most vulnerable. Russia has already lost 918,000 soldiers to Putin's invasion, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. It has also lost over 10,500 tanks and more than 25,000 artillery systems. Russian planes, ships, armoured fighting vehicles and drones have all been lost in the hundreds of thousands. Putin's military is at the weakest it's been for several years, and that's not to mention the sheer amount of money Russia is spending on the Ukraine war, along with the economic problems that lies in its future due to that spending. So, ramping up military aid in response to Putin's peace refusal strengthens Trump's position at home and makes Russia weaker. Those benefits, combined with Trump being very angry at Putin, might just be enough to push the US president into doing something that would have seemed unthinkable just a couple of months ago, backing Ukraine to win the fight rather than forcing Zelensky to the table. And if all of that isn't enough to convince Trump to take a more direct approach to dealing with Putin's actions in Ukraine, there's also Iran to consider. Right now, Trump is trying to bring Iran to the table for negotiations over the country's nuclear program. American warships are also stationed in the Red Sea, where they've conducted daily bombing against Houthi militants since March 15. Those militants are Iranian proxies, meaning strikes against them amount to hitting Iran in many people's minds. What does any of that have to do with Putin? After Iran refused to enter negotiations with Trump, the US president said, if Iran don't make a deal, they'll be bombing. It will be bombing the likes of which they've never seen before. That claim drew a response from Russia's deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov. Threats are indeed being heard. Ultimatums are also being heard, said the Putin mouthpiece. We consider such methods inappropriate. We condemn them. We consider them a way for the US to impose its own will on the Iranian side. Ryabkov also suggested that there will be catastrophic consequences if the US were to follow through on its bombing threats. If Trump is angry with Putin over the Ukraine peace issue, this latest Russian statement about Iran will make him furious. It shows that Russia is willing to poke its nose into US affairs at a time when the relationship between Trump and Putin seems to be on the verge of souring. Perhaps Trump will look for some measure of revenge for Russia coming out on Iran's side and threatening consequences for US actions. Could that revenge amount to even deeper support for Ukraine via sanctions and more military aid to hurt Putin? Let us know what you think the answer to that question might be in the comments. Are we seeing the end of the positive relationship between Putin and Trump? What does all of this mean for the future of the Ukraine war and Trump's drive for peace? Share your opinions with us, and don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show for up-to-the-minute commentary on the latest developments in the Ukraine peace process. We're a source of daily, accurate news about military conflicts around the globe and greatly appreciate your support.